Turn the lights back on. Wow. Retro electro tech. When real audio ruled the world.
Greetings once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is Retro Ernest of Retro Electro Tech. And here on the Hendrix bench, as I call it, is the 1961 Magnavox Imperial Micromatic turntable that I've completed. And before I get it boxed up and ready to go in the next day or so, I wanted to make one more video to point out some information for the customer that he may find useful and perhaps interesting. In fact, I wasn't going to make this video available to the general public, this last video, because I've already done several videos on this unit here. But I know there's those of you who do like to kind of follow along with these videos that cover this era of turntable, these Micromatic type of turntables, and all of these older turntables, I suppose. So I am going to, since I am making it available to all of you guys, I'm going to probably incorporate a little bit of video footage and perhaps some images that sort of reinforce what I'm talking about and what I'm pointing out for the customer, just to make it a little bit more interesting than just me, jaw-jacking on the topic, which is going to be the case with a lot of this video. But again, that's why it was mainly going to be a customer video. So, hold on to your hats and, feel free to come along for the ride. Those of you who are critical of these type of videos, well, it's a video, so you don't have to watch it. So let's go ahead and get to it. I'm going to be demonstrating also too a little bit more on the record dropping aspect of this, changer, and talking on that subject a little bit. So this is just, that kind of video. So let's just kind of vibe into it. And, if you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. So anyways, let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, y'all, as I demonstrated in a previous video, all is functioning as it should. As far as the cycling aspect of things, the tone arm lift and set down and end of play, the return and so forth. Everything is operating smoothly, at least as smooth as such a mechanism was intended to operate. Of course, something like this was not manufactured to aerospace precision because the manufacturer didn't intend for it to make a lunar landing or to play records on the surface of the moon. But as far as what it was intended for, it does the job quite well. Okay, so what do you do when a German Shepherd has you by the shoe? Well, I've never been in that situation, but I know one thing for sure. For those of you that haven't witnessed such a thing, you can cross that off your bucket list. I am here to entertain you.
He's scaring the children.
So what I want to do in this next phase of the video is discuss some adjustments that are a bit more critical that you're going to want to make note of, that go a bit beyond the typical screwdriver adjustments here on the top, involving the tone arm height, the tone arm set down, and so forth. I had a few minor issues with this specimen here that prompted me to get back underneath and drop the subplate assembly and verify some adjustments, mainly involving the tone arm assembly, the clutch boss and some of those levers there, check some clearances and whatnot. So I'm going to pull up some previous video footage in a moment, and I'm going to freeze frame on a few areas here and there as I discuss the relevant areas of adjustment that I'm going to be, again, freezing on and, talking about. So I'm going to edit that in and discuss a few things and try to clarify what is involved in going through and performing service, especially if you're going to get into the extent of, pulling everything apart properly, cleaning all the mechanisms, relubricating everything. Then you're certainly going to have to go through and perform different adjustments and verify the alignment of the various levers and so forth. so that things obviously function properly. And I'll touch on that a bit. You know, no one video or even, you know, a series of videos can handhold you through and walk you through every little detail. That would be very lengthy, but I will at least try to cover the meat and potatoes, the nuts and bolts, and so forth. So let's go ahead and dive in a bit deeper. Okay, folks. So what we're looking at is a still image that I extracted from a previous video, and the reason I'm bringing this image up is to go over some important adjustments that assure proper tracking and cycling of the tone arm, some of those levers that you see there on the subplate that we're looking at. So one aspect of reassembly as it pertains to adjustments and making sure that things are in proper alignment is when you're going to be mounting the tone arm back to the nut right here, okay, that is part of that whole pivot tube assembly. And what I'm pointing to down here, the position lever, the tone arm needs to be in parallel or straight on with this position lever, because as the tone arm is tracking across the record grooves, that position lever is going to be tracking in sync or in alignment with that tone arm. Okay, so again, if that tone arm and that position lever are out of alignment with each other, then things are not going to track and cycle properly. Things are going to be off a bit. And the reason for that is if we bring our attention back to the position lever, the end of the position lever here, well, on the underside of it, there's a small follower pin that moves in the direction of the arrow there as the tone arm moves across the vinyl. Because remember, the position lever and the tone arm are in alignment with each other. So eventually that follower pin is going to reach this section of the large lever you see here, which is referred to by the manufacturer as the striker feed lever. Okay, and when that follower pin engages with the striker feed lever, it will start to move it via its pivot point here. Okay, it starts to move it, and this section of the striker feed lever that the arrow is pointing to, okay, will start moving as well, and it's going to start moving in this direction here. Notice the arrow, okay, and it's going to just move slowly because obviously it's going to be moving at the speed that the tone arm is tracking across the vinyl. So obviously not high speed, right? So as this section of the striker feed lever moves along its range of travel and in its direction of travel, you'll notice on top of it there's a smaller lever, and it's referred to as the striker arm. Okay, now it is very light in weight, that little striker arm, so it kind of has the ability, you see that it's on its own pivot right here. Okay, so as that striker feed lever is moving in this direction, okay, as indicated by the arrow, the striker arm is also moving and just kind of, it has the ability to kind of pivot on top of the striker feed lever. And again, it's very light, so it just moves under its own friction. And again, light. It's very lightweight, so we don't want to hinder its movement by applying lubricant between it and the striker feed lever. Okay, we want to keep that area nice and dry. So I'm going to get into what happens in just a moment, but so far what I'm trying to point out here when reassembling all of these mechanisms, it's very important to make sure that we have that what do you call it? I'm having one of those senior moments. But the position lever, okay, you want to make sure that's in alignment with the tone arm. Very important. And you want to make sure that that striker feed lever is moving freely along its points of travel or ranges of travel. Both this section here that the arrow's pointing to, at the rear, and this section here at the front or the top, whatever you want to refer to that position as. You want to make sure that they're pivoting smoothly. Now, in determining what is going to be the best course of action in assuring that, when assessing a mechanism like this, again, I will make decisions based on my findings, and in this case, I noticed there was some friction, being produced by that striker feed lever as it was kind of running along its ranges of travel on that subplate chassis. So I did a few things. Again, in this video, I showed that I applied a little bit of lubricant. I used a very light grease. I used lithium grease, just very light, and I mean light in viscosity and light in application as far as the amount that I used. And what I didn't show in the video toward the end is I always go back and I do a cleanup. I go through with a swab and I just kind of finesse everything, and I will have the tendency to go through and wipe off even more lubricant and just lighten things up even more, because I want to leave behind a very, very clean application, a very light amount. And another thing I did was with a little flat screwdriver, standard screwdriver, whatever, I lifted up, I kind of bent the two areas here and here. I just very, very carefully and just a tiny bit just kind of bent them upward just a little bit to assure that they were not going to be experiencing any friction as they travel by rubbing on the subplate chassis too much. Okay, but when I say bend, I'm talking about barely noticeable. I'm not talking about bending them up and making it look like a saddle bend or something like that, but just very slight. You could just barely even notice it. And like I said, and to also help aid the range of travel of that striker feed lever, that's why I chose to use a little light smear, very light smear, and I cleaned it up after of very light viscosity, lithium grease. And sometimes you don't even have to use a lubricant there. Some people don't use a lubricant there. They choose not to. That is going to be entirely up to you, but I want to mention that because there's a few ways to go about assessing that striker feed lever and whether or not it's moving nice and free, and what actions you want to take to assure that it's going to remain that way. So there you go. So real quick, getting back to what happens with that striker arm that's riding on top of that striker feed lever. When the tone arm gets to the end of the vinyl, you know what happens, right? Where it gets sucked in or pulled in by the lead out groove, and then it lifts up. The reason why that is because as it gets pulled in, the striker arm at that point has enough momentum where it's kind of pulled into the platter hub with enough momentum, and it's struck by that projection or bump on the underside of that platter hub, and then the striker arm is forced rearward. And when it's forced rearward, it essentially activates the main cam gear and starts the cycling process, and the tone arm lifts and returns and all that. So again, as you can see, I know it was kind of a long-winded explanation for some, but that's what's taking place. And that's why everything needs to be in alignment when it comes to that position lever, the tone arm. You need to make sure that everything is okay with that striker feed lever as far as its movement, and that it's not being hindered in any way, shape, or form, that everything is okay with that striker arm and so forth, okay? So I just wanted to bring that out because when you're getting into reassembly and all that, you need to be aware of all that. Of course, there's other things as well, but I can't possibly cover all the details. So there you go. Anyways, let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so here we are on this image again, but we're not going to camp out on it too long. By the way, too, pardon the noise in the background. I'm running the heat today. It's a little bit cold here in Maine, at least for this California boy, and I don't want to deal with that today in the shop, especially. So anyways, but the reason why, again, I'm focusing on this image again, because we're going to concentrate on this general area that I have circled around here, just underneath this black tone arm base. And the area that I'm referring to under here is the tone arm clutch assembly, and there's a particular mechanism referred to as the clutch boss, and extending out from that area is this lever here, the clutch lever. And just like the other tone arm position lever here, this lever also has a follower pin, and you can see the pin here at the bottom, and you can see where both pins rivet to this lever. But anyways, yeah, we're gonna talk about some aspects of adjustment regarding this clutch assembly. And I brought this image back up once again because you're not going to be able to see this clutch lever all that well in the other images. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out. And also too, I'm going to throw out the disclaimer once again that I can only cover so much information, so sometimes gaps have to be filled in, as I already brought out, but I'm at least going to cover the nuts and bolts so that I can get a lot of you on the right track when you're reassembling all this stuff, and just so you kind of know what's going on here and the importance of these mechanisms. But again, I can't cover every single detail, so just be aware of that. So anyway, the two levers there, the clutch lever and the tone arm position lever, their clearances in terms of their vertical clearance, I guess, is important and needs to be set just so. I can't give you exact clearances because it will vary sometimes between one specimen and the next, okay? But in the ballpark is what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to. So as far as that tone arm position lever is concerned that I talked about earlier on, its follower pin there, you can see that the follower pin rests or functions, operates within that hole there, that slot, okay? And you can see through that slot there's a structure underneath, and those structures there are a couple of levers that are positioned together that are referred to as tone arm lift levers. And from underneath there, those levers are what push up on the tone arm lift spindle, and you can see that spindle extending up through that tone arm nut that the tone arm mounts to, okay? So I'm not going to get into those, but why I am bringing those up is because if that tone arm position lever was dropped down too low, I've seen cases where that follower pin will hit against the lift levers there, okay? So again, when we're talking about some adjustments involving that clutch assembly or that clutch boss is going to be lifted a bit to get these levers in alignment in terms of vertical clearance, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and get into a few more specifics. but just know that. So we don't want it up too high either, because if that tone arm position lever was up too high, then it would overshoot the slot that the follower pin is riding within, and it would miss the striker feed lever that I was talking about earlier also altogether. Okay, so we don't want it down too low where it's going to hit the lift levers. We don't want it up too high where it's going to overshoot the the slot there that it's riding in, and not move the striker feed lever like it's supposed to do, in harmony with the tone arm moving across the vinyl. Okay, and that clutch lever there, the follower pin, rides within some grooves or tracks on the main cam gear, and I'm going to get into that. So I just wanted to bring that up to help you to see the importance of getting into these adjustment, or this phase of the adjustment that involves the whole tone arm assembly there, and the tone arm base and the clutch assembly and all that. That's another important adjustment. And again, I can't get into all of it, but I'm at least going to cover the more critical adjustments. So let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so you can see that we have that whole subplate assembly just kind of flipped around, and we're looking at the back side of the tone arm assembly, the clutch assembly, and you could see I have a feeler gauge, a 5/1000ths of an inch feeler gauge between the bottom of that clutch boss and the top of the subplate. Now, does it have to be exactly 5/1000ths of an inch? Well, not necessarily, but just, again, somewhere in the ballpark. So anyways, in establishing that clearance, you're going to need something to lift up on that clutch boss from the bottom there, between it and the top of the subplate there. So I used a small screwdriver, and I loosened the two little bolts or little screws on the back of that clutch boss. There's one here where the arrow's pointing, and around the other side where the other arrow's pointing. Okay, and you don't want to loosen them off too much, because when it comes time to tighten them up again, when you have everything positioned the way you need it to be positioned, you don't want to be spending too much time screwing those nuts back in, or excuse me, those bolts back in, because the more that they're backed off, of course, the longer you're going to have to hold all that stuff in position. Excuse me. So just keep that in mind. And also too, the nut that you see up at the top that the tone arm mounts to, once again, there has to be a little space between it, the bottom of it, and the top of that black tone arm base. So on a lot of these units, between those 2 points, there's what they refer to as a flue-on washer. A flue-on washer is a PTFE washer, so it has a really slick fill to it, and that just aids in the effortless swivel of the tone arm, because obviously you don't want any friction created between those 2 points. So when you're performing that adjustment, you have to be careful not to push down on that nut too tightly while you're performing that fulcrum action. And I'm going to throw a picture up in just a moment of how my hand was positioned, but again, you want to allow some space between, again, that black tone arm base and the bottom of that nut, and you'll get the feel of it. I can't really walk you through that in detail, because that's something you have to just, again, you have to gauge on your own. And as far as that PTFE washer is concerned, I don't know if all the units have those in place. They are really thin, and some of them probably wear out over time, and just fall out of that space between the bottom of the nut there on the top of that tone arm base. But even if it's not there, or even if yours didn't have it to begin with, not a big deal. What's more critical is the spacing between those 2 points. You just want to make sure that you don't have things binding up, that you don't have that nut pushed down really hard on that that black tone arm base, have them sandwiched together too tight. When you move that nut with your fingers and kind of pivot it back and forth, it should feel effortless, almost loose, because remember, when the tone arm is mounted onto that nut, if it's binding up, then the tone arm's not going to track across the vinyl. It's just not going to work. So there's not really no rocket science there, as I say, so not a big deal. And then once you have that established, again, when you lift that clutch boss from the bottom with a little screwdriver or whatever you're using, and you kind of fulcrum it up into position, you just want to hold everything in place. That's why I'm inserting this image here, and you can see my hand is kind of C-shaped, and my thumb is kind of being used to fulcrum that screwdriver, and my fingers are on the top of that nut. So that helped me to hold everything in place, and I was able to insert my gauge at the same time and make sure that I had everything in the ballpark there. And then because I didn't have those little bolts backed out too far, I was able just to tighten one of them real quick and then lock everything in place, and then I tightened the other one and secured everything. You might have to do it a few times and mess around and experiment, but it's not a difficult thing to do if you just kind of coordinate yourself there and just keep everything held in place. And if you do that, everything will be okay. What I want to mention too before moving on is that the nut that the tone arm mounts to up at the top there's going to be an indentation on it, because of course the tone arm was mounted onto that nut, so there's going to be a mark left behind by the little bolt that is fastened in place to hold the tone arm onto it. So that little mark, that indentation, needs to be in alignment. When you're doing this adjustment, it needs to be in alignment and maintained in alignment with the tone arm position lever on the front that we spoke about earlier. And what I like to do is swing that position lever all the way to the right, and right in reference to our current view. So those levers are on the front, we're looking at the back of the assembly, so all the way over to the right in full engagement with the striker feed lever, in other words, all the way over. So again, that indentation on the nut kind of centered with the tone arm position lever, and you got to hold all this in place while you're holding down the nut lightly, maintaining the spacing between the bottom of it and the tone arm housing, once again the top of the tone arm housing, while you maintain the space of the bottom of the clutch boss versus the top of the subplate chassis. So again, that's why you see the way I'm holding everything in place, and then get everything tightened down. Another adjustment point I want to mention is where you see the arrow pointing. There's that nut there and little bolt, and by adjusting that will allow you to further adjust or raise and lower the clutch lever that we talked about earlier, and where the arrow is pointing now. So that being said, you want to make sure that the follower pin on that lever is, again, and I mentioned this before, just riding above, floating if you will, slightly, and I mean ever slightly, above the floor or surface of the tracks that it rides within on the main cam gear. That's important. Now you will have to experiment a little bit, but just keep in mind that if that lever / follower pin is too high, then it's going to jump the track. If it's too low, then it's going to be producing unnecessary friction as it drags along the floor or surface of the cam gear and its tracks, as mentioned earlier. So let me go ahead now and move on to discussing some aspects of record dropping, especially for the customer, because not all vinyl stacked on the spindle are going to drop the same. Sometimes they're going to drop multiples, and sometimes they'll drop just fine. And I'm going to explain why this is. So let's go ahead and move on. Okay folks, so we are in the home stretch, and I'm just going to get through this because this video has already gotten pretty lengthy. So you're all welcome to follow along still at this point, although this is a little bit more for the customer, because I'm going to cover some aspects of record dropping pertaining to this turntable. And it's applicable to other turntables as well. You know, the different generations of turntables and so forth and so on, and you know, the different types of spindles and all that. But when it comes to stacking vinyl and dropping vinyl down on the platter and all that, sometimes you're going to experience multiple records dropping, and instead of just one at a time. And yeah, although that could be a problem with some aspects of adjustment and even the spindle itself, especially when the spindles get all encrusted with you know, dirt and crap, and they start getting sticky and all that. But that's not the case here. The spindle is fine. Everything's been cleaned out, and the appropriate precision machine oil or turntable oil, whatever you want to refer to it as, has been applied where applicable. I've already gone through the record dropping adjustment, which is located on the bottom there. There's a little plate and all that. I'm not going to get into that, maybe in another video. So I'm zoomed in on the spindle, as you can see, and I'm not going to get into a great amount of detail once again, but you can see that everything is fine in regard to the push-off pawl here, and you know, everything is nice and free. There's nothing binding up. Like I said, I've already been through the adjustments to make sure that the push-off pawl is extending out where it needs to extend during cycling. Everything is good, but it comes down to the you know, spacing you know, between the shelf and up in here, depending on the spacing, depending on the spindle, you know, again, makes and models and all that, and the thickness of the vinyl, that's going to dictate how the records drop, how well they drop in terms of how they should drop, and that's one at a time. So I will demonstrate with some different thicknesses of vinyl, and you will see what I'm referring to. Sometimes if you put a couple of thicker pieces of vinyl on here, they drop just fine. Sometimes if the spacing of the stacked vinyl doesn't exceed the thickness that it needs to exceed, when you have a couple of pieces of vinyl stacked or a bunch of pieces of vinyl stacked, then sometimes you'll get, you know, the old double drop, or whatever the case. You'll have a couple that drop at the same time and all that. So let me go ahead and just demonstrate that. Okay, so here's a couple of pieces of vinyl that are a little bit thicker cumulatively, in that you know, it takes up a little bit more of the spacing, and they seem to be working better in terms of dropping one at a time. So let me just go ahead and kind of demonstrate and see what it does. Okay, so that first one set down okay. Now let's go ahead and drop that second one, which of course that's going to drop because, you know. Okay, so there we go. All right, so anyways, let me just use that. Good enough. All right, now I'm going to try it with a couple of pieces that cumulatively are thinner, and it'll probably drop both of them at the same time. Probably. Okay, so I have a couple other pieces together that are cumulatively a little bit thinner and don't work as well with the spacing between the shelf and you know, the other lever of the spindle there. Excuse me. So let's see what happens. And you know, sometimes, you know, it will work even with a couple thinner pieces, but it's a little bit more rare that it does. So let's just kind of see if it ends up dropping both of them. I have a feeling it will. Well, it worked that time. Okay, so I was wrong there, but it's not going to do that all the time. Okay, because I've been testing this and testing this and testing this, you know, because I test everything pretty extensively. Let's actually try that again and see what happens. Of course, the funny thing is, now that I'm doing this on camera, watch it work every time, right? So let's see here. Yeah. Well, that's good, you know, actually, and you know, it's, so as far as the customer is concerned, it may work, you know, more often than not, but just be aware of that, because it will kind of let you down sometimes, and you might think, well, you know, there's a problem with, you know, the adjustment or something, and I'll be honest with you, that's not the case. Just please keep that in mind. I'm going to grab another piece of vinyl to use with this one again. Let's just do this until it proves me right. There we go. Sometimes you just got to find the right combination of, you know, two thinner pieces of vinyl. So let's go ahead and give it a whirl again and see what we got going here. See, so there you go. So when you get two pieces that are a bit thinner, that's going to happen. So anyways, let's go ahead and move on. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but if you're interested in those dimensional standards of vinyl, feel free to check out that RIAA. There's information available, the Record Industry Association of America, or Recording Industry Association of America, that you know, highlights the different dimensions in terms of thickness, etc. of vinyl. And again, there are some differences in thickness, and you know, especially that has taken place over the years, and I just demonstrated that. Now, I didn't hold the vinyl up and start you know, taking measurements and all that, but if you have vinyl, do that. Look at some of your older stuff, compare some of the thicknesses if you don't already know that, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And you could just research the entire topic if you want, and you know, what happens with a lot of these situations where multiple pieces of vinyl drops and all that stuff, and on account of the different thicknesses and the, you know, different spindles and all that. You know, it's something that's just a known fact. So this is almost ready to package up and ship out, but I have another adjustment I have to make. There's now an issue with the speed adjustment. Not the actual speed itself. The speed is fine, but the dial here has kind of loosened up a bit, and there's a pin that I've got to work on in there. So I just wanted to mention that. So yet another delay. Sorry about that, but it's just the way it goes. It's not anything that you know, I could have helped, but you know, as far as just wear and tear goes, that's just the way it is sometimes. But so I'm going to have to disassemble this whole speed assembly here, selector assembly, and get into there and make a few adjustments and all that. And that will be the last thing I have to do, the last bug, hopefully, that I'll have to work out. Everything is looking good elsewhere, like I said, not a problem, but there's been a little finickiness to this turntable, and now this is one of them here, so I'm going to have to toy with this. So once that's done, it's done. I'm not even going to make a video on that. I'm not going to show anything else. I'm done with this turntable, and once I resolve that, it's going to be in the box, on its way back home. So otherwise, as I always say to you guys, peace, love, music, and the vintage audio that brings it to your ears. Till next time.
This is a poor man's shoe production.